Welcome to the Just Jesus podcast. On today's episode, we're going to continue to explore the intersection of history and faith. We're going to continue to dive deeper into this discussion where we talk about the clash between divine promise and human ambition. So join us today. We're going to discuss this and much more next. Welcome to the Just Jesus podcast. Yes, you are correct. Episode 6, in case you're wondering, new music. So decided to change it up a little bit. And maybe if you were having a slow day, maybe that made it a little more exciting. So good to have you with us. If you're brand new to Just Jesus, we're so glad to have you here joining with us. And it is simply what it says in the title. It's Just Jesus. We talk about every aspect of Jesus from all angles, past, present, and future, and what that means to you and I today. And as we do that, we challenge one another and we continue to grow in our faith and knowledge of who Jesus Christ really is. So if you fit in that category, then I believe you're going to get something out of the next 45 minutes or so. And if you know somebody that fits in that category that could be challenged and encouraged in the same way, then consider sharing this with them. So it's good to have you here. Again, appreciate all of you that continue to give me so much positive feedback and encouragement so far along the way. And we've had such a good time, 6 episodes into it. So it's exciting and I've enjoyed these. And so I'm glad that you have enjoyed them as well. And as always, help us get the message out by simply clicking that like button or subscribing if you haven't already subscribed, but click the like button and drop a comment. Just to drop a one-word comment. Doesn't even have to be that long. What that does is it pushes us higher up on the YouTube algorithm and potentially gets YouTube to do all the work for us. And from the standpoint of YouTube can be used to share this message. But also, if you know someone directly that you feel like could be impacted by these, please share that. And again, it's no way to get any kind of self-recognition on my part, but it is a desire to just, I believe the message of Jesus Christ needs to be spread far and wide. And so here we've decided to take the direction of just Jesus and not getting into theology or doctrine or tying this to a specific church, but just talking about Jesus. So it really makes it ability to share with anyone. If they believe in Jesus, then I believe they can get something out of this. But if you are a listener and you have made it this far, you know that we are kind of on the tail end of what really is episode 4C. Technically it's episode 6, but really it's episode 4C because we are coming to the end of our little mini series within the podcast where we have been talking about the perfect storm surrounding Jesus. And we've been examining that because not only by examining that have we seen who Jesus is in the framework of the time he came and past the obvious stuff, right? Born of a virgin, died, resurrected, all those things that are extremely important. But we've taken a larger view that has helped us further explore just exactly what Jesus was up against, how he navigated that, and why it still matters today. Because what we have discovered so far, that if we're not careful, we are bound to repeat the same errors of those that were alive during the time of Jesus' first visit to earth. And so if we're not careful, we will fall prey to our own pride and arrogance, and we too will fall victim to the same misconceptions that the first century citizens fell to when Jesus showed up for them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time building all of this because, again, I've gone through this in 2 podcasts and I don't want to spend more time today. Needless to say, the context of what we're talking about, we're using the context of the perfect storm. This was the storm that took place off the coast of Massachusetts in 1991. It was called the perfect storm because it was a convergence of 3 major storms that sort of came to one place at one time, and stuck in the middle of that was this little fishing boat. Well, it wasn't little, but compared to the storm, but it was this fishing boat called the Andrea Gale that ended up just being destroyed. And it was a tragic thing, and that tragic event turned into a movie. And again, I say it again, I've said that the last 2 episodes, I don't endorse the movie. I don't even remember much about the movie. So if you go watch it, it's terrible, or it has inappropriate things in it. I'm not endorsing you go watch it. If you watch it on your own cognition. However, I'm using that as the framework because it's a very famous story beyond the movie of this kind of convergence of this megastorm that was titled The Perfect Storm because it had 3 different elements that came together. So we've used that to talk about the perfect storm that Jesus came to. He could have come to any time, any place in history, yet he chose to come to this particular place at this particular time, which was sort of right in the middle of a perfect storm. And we've kind of discussed the 2 obvious storms already. We talked about the Roman storm, which is, we looked at it from maybe a little bit of a different perspective than maybe you've heard before. So hopefully that, kind of enlightened you more to an understanding of what it must have been like to be living in that time and dealing with a Roman perspective. And then we got into more last week about the Jewish perspective, more of the Jewish perspective and sort of the framework. And so we're going to talk about the third today. And to do that, let's step back for a second if we can, because in the ancient Jewish belief, the vision of God was seen as sort of this all-powerful, unpredictable force that was the ultimate ruler, the supreme ruler, right? And despite the hopes that they had, we find that throughout the story of Israel and the Jewish people, they're often at odds with God's plan. In fact, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but we call it the Old Testament. It's called the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the first 39 books of the Bible, if you're familiar with that at all. That is, your Bible says Old Testament. Technically, it would be the Hebrew Scriptures, but it's the first 39 books. And a lot of those pages are filled with prophets reminding Israel, and I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but they're reminding Israel that, listen, your story may not align with God's plan, and you should be prepared for that. And really what they were trying to do is it was a warning that, listen, hey, Israel, you should be aware that God's plan might not always align with your own hopes and dreams. Now, I will tell you, when I was studying this and I put all this together and was prepared for this podcast, that really jumped out because we could go hours just on that one point. Maybe we'll come back to that. Just the fact that how little sometimes our dreams and visions align with what God's plan really is. And so here's a prime example in this scenario. So obviously we know God had promised to return in power and glory and establish a kingdom on earth. And we talked about this last week, but this sparked immense amount of hope and anticipation among the Jewish people. And this was was reaching a fervor pitch when we get to the time that Jesus enters the scene. But the problem was they sort of have envisioned this divine return, if you want to call it that, as a validation of their national aspirations. And so constantly the prophets of the Old Testament and even to the preceding prophet of the birth of Jesus Christ, John the Baptist, continued again to caution this narrative that God's arrival wouldn't be on your terms. It's going to be on his terms. It was going to be with his purpose. And so they were being warned, even in the midst of all this, they were being told, listen, you're not getting it. It's not going to come like you think. And Jesus sort of perceived this and spoke of this that the time he came was the junction of God's prophetic vision clashing with this prevailing national identity. We talked about this last week more from the standpoint of the Jewish identity. And so we see Jesus even understanding that and making mention of that that this was something to be aware of and had been warned of. In fact, we talked about this in the very first episode, and again, I haven't watched it. Some of you referenced that it was actually something you watched, and no one was endorsing it. It was just a reference. But someone had told me that the Jesus Christ Superstar and told me a little more about it. So I looked up. Again, I didn't watch it. Not that I was particularly making a stand one way or the other. I just didn't have the time to sit down and watch it. But we're telling me about about a particular part and sort of the way it was written. And so I went back to kind of look at that scene. I didn't look at it, I read about it. And there's a scene in Jesus Christ Superstar where Jesus rejects Simon the Zealot's call for a revolution. And it was kind of interesting. And again, I don't know. We talked about this first episode. I'm not going to get back into this again. But I thought it's interesting because it really was sort of, they did a good job at capturing this idea of this disconnect between this national aspiration and divine purpose, as we're talking about. And they kept sort of this narrative. And so the people, including Simon, they lacked this understanding of the true power and glory of Jesus. And this sort of really echoed well in this scene in Jesus Christ Superstar, but it really plays out this whole thing where we talked about in the very opening podcast, and that was this idea when Jesus is riding in to Jerusalem, which we're about to celebrate here on Palm Sunday. When he's riding on Jerusalem, they're cheering and he's crying. Because ultimately you see the disconnect, because to them it was a return to national identity, and he realized that they were missing the divine purpose. In fact, if we go further, not that this is what we're going to talk about today, but I believe that's sort of, for those of you that are familiar with the story of Jesus and Lazarus. Why can't I get that out? Sometimes a word just gets stuck in there. Hopefully I'm not the only one that, if has it happened, comment down below if that's happened, make me feel better. Jesus and we'll call him Lazarus. There we go. I get it out there this thing. If I keep talking, I'm going to either say the name or start speaking in tongues, one or the other. So Lazzy. When the Bible talks about Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible, many say that he was weeping because they were weeping. And in fact, but if you look at that, he was really weeping over this sort of misunderstood interpretation of national aspiration and divine power. So again, Jerusalem was at the center of all this, and it's got the cherished temple, the sort of the symbolized national identity and the essence of Israel, the city, and Jewish faith itself. It's sitting there. But ultimately, the leaders and most of the people there failed to recognize that they were in the middle of a divine visitation, which ultimately led to the downfall of all of this. So let's talk about the third storm. We talked about the first storm. A lot of you asked, what's the third storm going to be? What is it going to be? What is it going to be? And I told you last week, I don't think you would have guessed it. Maybe. I don't want to be unfair. Maybe you would have guessed it. But here's the third storm, as I have sort of framed this. First storm is Rome. Second storm is the Jewish storm, the national identity. We talked about that last week. But the third storm, the hurricane, if you remember the story, the premise of the perfect storm, that last one being the hurricane, which really sent it over the edge. In this scenario, the hurricane is God himself. Yes, you heard me right. God is the third element in all this. Because in the midst of this storm, it's Jesus who proclaimed that it was God's moment. It was God's moment. There was a divine intervention that was sort of playing out, unfolding right in the midst of all this chaos. But what's sad is, and it's crazy because I see it kind of being repeated a little bit today, but you can see it played out in the whole story, in the whole narrative. So many remained oblivious because they were so consumed by their own desire for this national liberation that was going to lead them to sort of this direct confrontation with the evil empire that was Rome. And when Jesus comes along, he continues the narrative that had been told to them over and over again. Jesus cautioned them that these aspirations they had, they weren't aligning with God's ultimate plan. Yes, God had chosen Israel for his people, yes. And this mission was about redeeming the world. But in reality, Israel itself stood in the need stood in need of redemption. And so instead of coming in on a stallion with tanks and airplanes, I mean facetious, but a stallion with chariots and armies, God approaches Israel through humility, riding on a donkey, but also fulfilling the prophecy of the prophet Zechariah, who prophesied that he would come and bring a peaceful kingdom. So this is the point in all this, is that it's telling us something about Jesus. We're going to get a little further into this. But it's telling us something we've got to pay attention about when we talk about who Jesus is and we talk about the real identity of Jesus. It's got to be something that we see now already played out here just in the first few minutes of this podcast that are echoed in the last podcast, and this. We've got to be careful when we're trying to identify Jesus and how we define him for us, that we don't let our view of Jesus become distorted, biased, based on our own personal identities, wishes, desires, however noble or moral they may be. And again, I see this playing out in America right now, and I'm going to deviate off the course here. We'll get back to it. But I'm going to deviate for a second because here's the relevancy to all this. And I'm not just rambling on giving you some facts that are sort of disjointed. What's the point? The point is this: look at modern Christianity today, especially what is categorized as evangelical Christianity today. Look at it today. There is a resurgence in evangelical Christianity to preserve our national identity. And this is a dangerous thing. Again, I'm not anti. I'm proud to be an American, or at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died who gave that right to me. I'm all for America. I'm going to vote. I mean, my goodness, when I was a teenager, I had, this is one of those things you wish you could just erase out of your memory, but it was what it was. I had these, back in the 90s, we had these big, huge, kind of like parachute pants, not quite MC Hammer parachute pants, but they were kind of really these big baggy pants. And so somewhere, I don't know where I got them. I don't know who sold them to me and why they didn't stop me from buying them. But I had these pants. One leg was the red and white stripes of the American flag. The other leg was the blue with the white stars. So I, at that time, I'm a teenager, I'm 6'4", wearing these pants that obviously at 6'4" are long. And I look like a big giant Uncle Sam walking around in an American flag. You can just, paint that picture. So I'm not that's not an anti-American statement, but my point is that everything within the Jewish ideology was framed about national identity. So when Jesus comes in, we've got this storm of national identity, and then God brings the storm in of divine purpose, and Jesus is sort of stuck right in the middle of all this. And I'm seeing this play out again because I'm truly believing for those of us that live in America, we are being pulled down the road of national identity becoming more important than our identity that's found in Christ. And so politics, divisiveness have entered into people that should be following Christ because we have chosen each side of an issue when in reality there is one side of the issue, and that's Jesus. Again, I'm not saying we should not stop voting. We should stop, believing for the greater good. But my identity is not as a citizen of the United States. My identity should be in Jesus Christ. And so again, my point is we see this played out right here on the pages of the story of Jesus Christ. And in some ways, it's being repeated now. And look at the ministry of Jesus. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, he embodied this rescuing and redeeming love that God had for Israel. It's beautiful, on display. But in the middle of all that beautiful, wonderful display, Jerusalem and its leaders failed over and over again to recognize this divine manifestation. And this hurricane of love and purpose clashed with the might, the cold front of the might of the Roman Empire, and then sort of the high pressure aspirations of Israel's national identity, and created this incredible amount of energy that we are dubbing the perfect storm. And right there in the middle of all of it was Jesus Christ. But as we look at the events of Jesus' final days, which we're about to celebrate here in the upcoming weeks, we got to be careful that we don't just view them as mere anomalies of history. But they really represent, these events represent the climax of this convergence between divine purpose and human ambition. And I keep echoing this because I want you to see this. I want you to hear this because, again, this is why the story of Jesus matters more than just simply the repeating of it for our entertainment or repeating of it for the increasing of our faith. The story of Jesus matters because if we're not careful, we're going to repeat the same thing again. So this retelling of the events is really where we see this hurricane, this third storm of divine love and purpose collide with earthly forces. And to really understand the significance, and a lot of you know this, but let's go a little further here. To understand the significance of Jesus' death, we got to really understand from a larger perspective the power of God's sovereign actions as told and depicted in scriptures that led up to these events. And this divine wind, this divine calling, is actually woven through the narrative of the Jewish story, the Jewish history. And it really continues to show God's power and sovereignty. Again, on one standpoint, this should not have been something they missed. It should have been something obvious. But by the time Jesus shows up, they are blinded by their national identity, their national aspirations. And right in the middle of all of this, Jerusalem, we got Jesus is at the center of all this, and Jerusalem plays the perfect backdrop. It's the epicenter of this divine drama. And Jerusalem stands in this symbolic position of the conflict of all these forces coming together. It's this place of fervent prayer and hope and belief in the midst of a world in pain. That's the picture. So, let's go further to that. So picture Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, let's paint the picture. I was going to add some ambient sound, but you can do it. Let's use your imagination. If you're driving, please do not close your eyes. But if you can, just go there for a second. Imagine your vision of what you think first century Jerusalem would have been like. The smells, the sounds. If you watch something like The Chosen, it'd probably be easier to do that. It's a bustling city. And past the markets and the tradesmen and the hustle and bustle that is normally associated with life and the existence of a human being in first century Jerusalem, right below the surface, but ever so building, is this anticipation. But it's also sort of veiled, if you want to call it this. It's veiled in perplexity. Because for the inhabitants of this epicenter, Jerusalem, their entire faith was interwoven with this deep longing, if we want to call it that, for the divine presence of their God. Nothing wrong with that. And they believed fervently. This is the point you got to get to, how fervently they believed that their God, not a God, but their God. You got to get that, the use of that word. Their God, not a God, not some God, but their God had made a sacred promise to dwell among them. Within, now you get this, not only dwell among them, but dwell among them within the sacred confines of the Jerusalem temple. So get this. This belief wasn't unfounded. In fact, it was completely substantiated throughout their upbringing and had been told for thousands of years to that point. And it really was deeply rooted in their religious heritage and their religious tradition and religious understanding. This idea that God had made a sacred promise. He was going to come dwell with them, and he was going to do that within the sacred confines of the Jerusalem temple. So the temple that's there at the time of Jesus Christ, which is the temple that's a direct descendant of Solomon's grand temple, stood as a symbol. Now get this is the clash, because, I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. I may not go here, but just throw this out there real quick. This is why when Jesus raised old Laz from the dead, remember we talked about Jesus wept, they got mad at him, and the statement they made on what we do with Jesus is because he's messing with our nation and our temple. He's messing with our national identity and aspirations and our temple, because the temple is central to all of this. So the temple, as they saw it, stood as the symbol of divine presence and purpose and hope. And you could trace the lineage of the temple all the way back to the simple tent, the tabernacle that was erected and fashioned by Moses in the wilderness, which was a part of their exodus out of Egypt, which again we talked about this last week, was so crucial to their national identity. But here's the point: despite the grandeur of the temple, the ancient prophets had foretold a sort of, for lack of a better term, a harrowing truth. This is, and they had already seen that their God had forsaken the temple during the all those tumultuous years we talked about last week in the exile of Babylon. Again, you're asking me, what does this have to do with Jesus? It has to do with a lot, because again, we got to choose which lens we're going to look at Jesus through. Jerusalem chose to look at the lens of Jesus through their own national identity, their own human ambition, and that's why they didn't see who Jesus really was. Rome was looking at Jesus through a whole different lens. They missed it. But here's the point. There was a continuation. No matter what, hope always endured in Israel amidst all these crazy, difficult, for lack of a better way of saying it, shadows of despair. And continually, the prophets of Israel spoke with conviction. And constantly, we see this over and over again. They assured the people of God, of people of Israel, that God's return was imminent. He's coming. And it was prophesied that there was a day when God would once again grace Mount Zion. That was the other term for the holy city of Jerusalem, Mount Zion. And he would come with his divine presence. And this was huge, because this promise resonated so deeply within the hearts, minds, the psyches of the Israelites, Jewish communities, and even in some ways the devout pilgrims that came to Jerusalem for the festivals, including Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus would have seen this. His first 30 years of existence, he would have been to Jerusalem. Before it was even announced who he was to the world, he had already seen this in action. He was very well aware of it. And so here's the part of it. So they had this desire, this great fervor for lack of a better way of saying it, divine kingship. They wanted God to be king, because they had gotten tired. They gotten disillusioned with earthly rulers. They were tired of it. No more. Done. In fact, I don't want to get too deep in this. This gets a little too deep than I want to be. But if you go research this out, you'll see the Hasmonean dynasty. You'll see that listed. It had left such a bitter taste in the mouths of the Israelites, Jews. And the rule of Herod and his successors, which is how we get to Jesus, had offered little solace, didn't really amend anything. So in the midst of these cycles of what let's, for lack of a better term, let's call it these cycles of hope and despair, it just reinforced and even championed this idea that God and he being king is our only path to true justice and lasting peace, which would only come from us restoring our national identity. In fact, it's interesting if you go back and you look at it a little bit, the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, who is where we get a lot of our historical information from, really shed light on the diverse forms of this movement. We talked about it last week, and furthermore, just sort of this this idea that there was this movement that was believing for this restoration. And private dreams and prayers that kept this flame alive were constantly being battered when actions failed. But there was this rallying cry in Israel for theocracy. If you don't know what theocracy is the government run by the priests or led by the priests. So the idea of theocracy became sort of the rallying cry. But only under the condition, not that man would be back in charge, but under the condition that the priest would be the representation, the fact that only God, this is huge, only God had the right to assume the mantle of rulership. Now you got to get this, because this is what I'm talking about. There was a continuation of this ingrained ideology that ended up leading to this misrepresentation of Jesus. And I feel like in some ways we're having it replayed here again. In fact, I remember reading this one time, and I went back and looked it up again because I thought it fit here. Bob Dylan, and I'm not a Bob Dylan fan, but Bob Dylan wrote a lyric in one of his songs. And the lyric is this: I am the Lord thy God is a fine saying, as long as it's the right person who's saying it. That's a very deep, and that's a deep dig there by Bob Dylan. But really what he's saying is, unless you've been deemed holy enough to say it, just the term, I am the Lord thy God, it's just, I don't want to get too deep, and that's going to get me in trouble. But it really is a powerful notion that this was sort of what was happening. And really what's crazy about it is when we think about an idea of a theocracy, right? A government led by priests. It wasn't as novel of an idea as it might appear to sort of our modern sensibilities. Because why? Again, here's the point. The scriptures echoed this consistently, this theme of divine kingship. In fact, in the very beginning, go back and look at this, when people initially desired for a human king, God's response, the divine response to that, was a sort of a rebuke, and affirmed this idea that God alone and God was their rightful sovereign king. And that's why the coronation of David, who was dubbed the man after God's own heart, carried such profound implications. Because David was the signal. Saul was kind of our guy. He messed up. So David kind of signaled a divine monarchy. We see that he was selected by God. And even though he was a divine monarchy, he was embodied in a human form. But this story of David, the saga really of David, if you want to call it that was marked by triumph and tragedy, it really sort of mirrored, in a lot of ways, the trajectory of Israel's own history. But as we watch David's story unfold, his ascension to the throne, it bore all the necessary hallmarks of divine favor. But his kingship kingship, his ruling, his time as ruler was really marred by, I mean, we don't have to go through all that, but tons of missteps, failures. And really it was the foreshadowing of sort of the fractures that would eventually fracture all of Israel in the coming years. But here's the point. Through all this, through all the wreckage, all the broken dreams, all the lingering promises, this promise by God to David through the prophet Nathan, this covenant, this sealed covenant with divine assurance, prophesying of an everlasting kingdom, and one that David's descendants would perpetuate God's reign on earth, is continued over and over and over again. So when Jesus Christ enters the scene, this is what the picture he steps into. And this is why Jesus was different. Because up to that time, we had a clash of national identity and Roman rule. If you go back for the first, go back within the first couple of hundred years of Jesus's arrival on the scene, we see numerous times that national identity reached a fever pitch, and spilled over into a revolution that was quickly squashed. But this was different. This is why I'm calling it the perfect storm. What was different about Jesus? It was the fact that it was his storm. He walked into the same storm, but yet he was accompanied by a third storm, and it was God himself. God was saying, this is my time and my purpose. And it was God that brought all this thing to a climatic conclusion. But here's the point. In the middle of that, with so many divine signs, with so many things that were checking off the right boxes, those that were in the middle of all that didn't see it. And all of this, the point I'm making is, just like the Andrea Gale didn't see the conversion of the three storms to the point that they would have said, you know what, not a good time to go out. If we're not careful, we're going to be in the middle of the same storm, because God's going to bring all this thing to a final conclusion as well. But here's the point. This is where it's just Jesus. We've got to go back to the fact that sometimes Jesus's identity doesn't match up with what we have in our hopes and dreams. This is huge. And even in the midst of being warned that this could happen, that this could be the case, that you could miss out on all this because you're looking for Jesus. And even there were stories in the Gospels that echoed this same thing. One in particular being when Jesus comes walking on the water, they don't even recognize it's him because they think he's a ghost. All these metaphors we talk about, we see that Jesus is in the storm. One time he's asleep, he stands up and says, peace, be still, showing the sort of metaphor, the fact in the midst of all this chaos, Jesus was the one with humility and peace. He was calm. But on the other side, Jesus is in the middle of another storm. He comes walking on water, and they don't see him. Why? They recognized the fact that it was somebody there, but they didn't recognize the identity, because they would have never imagined in the middle of that storm that Jesus would have come walking in that manner. And the point I'm making about that for us in our entirety, but more for you that are listening to me today, that are a part of this Just Jesus movement, where there's a call to get back to the trueness of who Jesus is, and nothing more, nothing less. Just make it about Jesus, and don't add to or take from. Just Jesus, not religion, not systems and decrees and doctrines and theologies and ideologies and all this stuff that converges to bring us away from the true identity. It's just Jesus. And I'm not here to say, let's get rid of the Bible, let's get rid of all this. But my point is that we've got to trust in him more than we trust in simply what we read, because they read it every day. They quoted it in their temple. They quoted it in their synagogues, but yet they didn't see it when it took place in their eyes, because it just didn't happen the way they thought it was going to happen. And so my caution to you is, as we search for Jesus in our own lives, we have to be careful that we don't search for him and that we already think we know how, what, when, where. that we miss him when he comes. Because we may be looking for a king on a horse, and we might get a servant on a donkey. That's the point. This whole opening, putting this in the beginning of the Just Jesus podcast is to say, listen, this is a conversation we need to have. We need to talk about Jesus, but we need to be willing to have conversations that may make us feel uncomfortable from the standpoint it may challenge our national identity. It may challenge our even religious predispositions because we've been told these things. But when we start talking about Jesus, Jesus is going to challenge anything and everything in us. Because if we're not careful, we're going to be blinded by it. We won't see it. And so my point to you today is as we get further into Just Jesus, as we further into exploring this, a lot of it's like, well, I already know this. I know it. I don't need to talk about it. But they knew it too. In fact, they knew it better than we know it today. They could quote every scripture that talked about Messiah. They could tell you when he was going to come, how he's going to come, where he was going to come. And yet when he came, they didn't even see it. It was already prophesied where he was going to be born. It was already prophesied what he was going to do. All the things that were necessary, prophesied, they were told, they were foretold continuously over and over again. And when the events started playing out in real time, they didn't see it. Wow. But I said it last week, and I just challenging us again. We've got to be careful that we're not so arrogant that we think it won't happen to us today. So what do we need to do? We've got to look at this with an open heart. We've got to look at this with an open heart to say, you know what? I don't care how Jesus comes, when he comes, I don't want to miss it. And I'm telling you, for what it's worth, take it for whatever it's worth, whether you believe me or not. I'm telling you, I see this happening today. We're going to talk about this next week. I see this today. I see the cry. I see the echoing, the proclaiming of Jesus. But it's not coming the way we think it should be. And so for us who are so connected to the promise, we're actually missing it because it's not coming exactly how we think it should be. And then we're kind of like the Jews. We're dismissing it because it doesn't match up with the way we think it should be, how we think we should do it. And if we're not careful, man, he's going to walk right by us. We're going to miss it. But I believe for those of us that are willing to be open to it, we're going to finally see Jesus like we've never seen him before. We're going to be able to see Jesus in ways we've never imagined before, because when you see Jesus for who he is, it changes you forever. Your life will never be the same. That's not hyperbole. That's not a cute bumper sticker. That's truth. So if you're willing to go on this journey with us here, Just Jesus, I want to explore, as the Lord allows us, explore so many different ways we can see Jesus in a new light. And I've heard so many of you talk about the profound effect of something like Chosen. And Chosen has had plenty of critics. And one of the critics it's been is just that, well, it's not perfectly accurate. Based on what? Yeah, there may be some things in Chosen that are sort of creative, where we can get out there a little bit creatively, but the purpose of Chosen has been just simply to share Jesus in a way we've never seen him before, and it has had a profound effect. In fact, I come across people on a weekly basis who would have never had a discussion about Jesus beforehand, but are willing to talk about Jesus now because of Chosen. But a lot of people, a lot of Christians are turned off by it because it's messing with their national identity and their temple. But yet somehow we think we're different than the early first century Christians or first century Jews. No, we're just repeating it. And that's the thing. They talk about history. If you don't study history, talk about history, you're bound to repeat it. This is why this is important to start off with, because if we don't talk about this to start off with, when we get further into the subject, a lot of you are going to miss out because you're going to dismiss me because you're going to say, well, that's not accurate. That's not right. That doesn't fit, because you've already predetermined how Jesus is going to come and what he's going to look like. So I just caution you, why don't we just put all that aside, our traditions, our thoughts, our ideologies, our theologies, and our doctrines, and say, let's just look at Jesus with a fresh new set of eyes. And you know what's amazing? The Bible says that he will guide us to truth because he has his Spirit that is available to us that will be the guide to that. So, little food for thought. So it's been, again, I don't want to be over preachy in these, so I don't mean to try to be preachy. I'm challenging, so hopefully it doesn't come across preachy, but hopefully you're challenged to say, I want to see Jesus like I've never seen him before. And that's why we're talking about just Jesus. We're going to strip it all down, get rid of all the layers, and we're just going to talk about Jesus, who he is, and more importantly, why does it matter today? So hopefully you see that already taking place. We're going to come back again next week and talk about this further. We're going to actually get into some real modern day examples of this that I feel like are happening right before us that I think we're dismissing, that we're going to talk about deeper next week. Just Jesus. Thank you for listening. We started off with some new music. I got some new music here at the end. So if you didn't hear anything I said, I'll leave you tapping your toes and maybe moving a little bit because you feel good. But anyways, until next time, just Jesus. Hope you come back and see us again. Well, if you can't see me, hear me again next time on Just Jesus.